Broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk where facts matter. Welcome to The Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ news and talk show on the radio in the United States. I'm your host, John Parker, also live streaming on our YouTube channel right now. And if you like what we're doing, click that subscribe button and leave us a comment about what we're going to be talking about today, because we're going to be unpacking a really big issue. This is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode, where we take a step back from the headlines and really dive into a specific expertise area of our guest. And if you are looking for the latest headlines, I just want to let you know, up next in Chicago is Democracy Now! In Minneapolis, it'll be the Matt McNeil Show. So obviously those two stalwarts are going to have a lot of breakdown of what's happening in the news today, which we know there is a lot happening right now. But what are we going to talk about today? The just announced and so-called greater than campaign to end marriage equality in the United States, and also just, anti-LGBTQ extremism. Our guest is Sarah M. Moore. She is the Anti-LGBTQ plus Extremism Analyst for GLAAD, focused on countering anti-LGBTQ plus extremism and hate. Previously, she worked as a general associate at the University of Maryland's START Global Terrorism Database. She has also worked with Bellingcat's Global Authentication Project and the Prosecution Project. Sarah, first time on The Gailey Show. Hopefully it won't be the last, but welcome to The Gailey Show.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
All right. Okay, let's start with the greater than campaign. And just to put this in context for folks, because I keep getting told by log cabin Republicans, by Supreme Court justices, at least two of them, all of these, people in the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, who's like, we're not coming for gay marriage. We're not coming for gay marriage. Well, here we are, this greater than campaign. So what's the deal? What is this? And what are they trying to do?
The greater than campaign. I feel like I got to take a big breath before we start talking about it. It's so crazy. And I feel like crazy. You're going to hear me say crazy a lot, because the arguments that are part of this campaign are just so mind-boggling and so beyond, I think, what most of us consider to be acceptable. But essentially, the Greater Than campaign is a coalition of 47 organizations that launched a new campaign at the end of January in this year, in which they are pushing for the Supreme Court to overturn the 2015 Obergefell ruling that allowed LGBTQ people the freedom to marry. And so it's a campaign based around the fact that they do not want LGBTQ people to get married, and especially do not want them to have children.
Okay. All right. So much to unpack here. You don't have to go through like all 47 of the organizations, but that was an eye-popping number for me. Who are the sort of the major folks that are part of this 47? Like who are the ones that are sort of spearheading and putting this all together?
Yeah, so it's really interesting when we're talking about greater than, because I think, when we say 47 orgs, I think a lot of people, their minds like kind of explode a little bit, because they're like, how can I possibly make sense? Exactly. Me too. When I first heard about this, how can I make sense of like 47 different organizations? There's so many different power players, so many people backing them, all of these different aspects that are really hard to kind of understand what's at the heart of this matter. And that's their intention, right? They have all of these different organizations signing on because they want to kind of obfuscate the main leaders behind this and the big donors that are behind this. The kind of the top organizations that are leading this campaign are Them Before Us, and a number of other big kind of these like pseudo legal / maybe church organizations that have been a historic part of the fundamentalist Christian movement in the US. Groups like Focus on the Family, the Family Research Council. We have others that, other names you might recognize, like the Daily Wire, that have signed on to this, Heritage Foundation, which is behind Project 2025, and a whole coalition of state groups that coincidentally all fall under the umbrella of the Family Policy Alliance, which is the lobbying arm for Focus on the Family. So even though you have these like dozens of state groups that are signed on, they're all still being coordinated by some of these major power players. So again, we can dive way more into this, but all that to say is that it may look like a lot of orgs, but there's really just kind of a small handful of people that are behind this and a bunch of big donors behind this as well.
We do a lot of author interviews on here. As the Gailey Show, we do a lot of covering book bans. And what you're talking about, where I'm going with that, is that this is also, there was one person who challenged 400 books in Wisconsin, I think 2 years ago. Like, it's always this tiny group of people who are able to have this outsized impact on America and attacking the queer community. So on the one hand, it doesn't surprise me that, it's actually, this whole group of folks is just, a smaller cadre of people that are trying to get rid of marriage equality. Do we know, like, why now? Because marriage equality has been pretty popular amongst Republicans and independents and Democrats. Like, why are they taking on an issue that the majority of Americans like right now, when they're already in the hole on so many other issues that we're dealing with right now, like the Constitution and the economy and all of that?
I would love to be able to have insight into the minds of some of these folks, because wow, what a crazy place to be. But I think if I had to take a guess, I would say that they see this moment in time as kind of one of their last chances to push for these big legal rulings, these state level rulings that they're also pushing for. They know that time is not on their side. They know that people are fed up with the administration. They're fed up with these various, conservative social policies. And they really see this particular moment, while they still have Trump in office, while they still have the support of SCOTUS, while they still have the support of a lot of different state governments, to try to take these kind of smaller steps towards their big goals of, what they've already accomplished in terms of overturning Roe v. Wade, and then going towards different rulings like Obergefell as well. So they kind of see this as like one of their last chances to really get a win in for their particular movement.
We are talking with Sarah Moore, Anti-LGBTQ plus extremism analyst for GLAAD, a nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ plus advocacy and cultural change. That resonates, this idea, this last gasp, or not last gasp, I wish it was last gasp, but this idea that they're never going to have it as good politically as they have it right now with the court and the executive branch. And does Congress even exist anymore? I don't even know if it exists anymore, but, ostensibly on paper, it's there. How can you put this in context for us, though, over the past, like the 21st century, the past 26 years? Because we kicked off the millennium with the National Organization on Marriage, right? Like, they were the ones sort of pumping out these, or they were one of the leaders of pumping out all these constitutional amendments against, in all the states, right? And I think there were like 27 or 28 states that had these things. And then we get the Obergefell ruling that basically said, nope, we're done with these, which means that there's a lot of states that still have these constitutional amendments on the books. Where does this fit in greater than with that original, like, National Organization of Marriage movement? Like, are you seeing this as something that is different, or are they just sort of grabbing the taking up the flame from the ashes of that particular movement?
Yeah. So, I think we could even take it back one step further too. We can, there has long been a movement in this country that is ostensibly centered on, quote, protecting the kids, but which is really just a hate-based campaign that is going after LGBTQ rights. We have seen this since, the origins of the LGBTQ rights movement back in Stonewall. For example, we first had Anita Bryant with her Save the Children campaign. This was a move first based out of Florida that was seeking to overturn their county rulings that banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And then they moved all the way out to California with Proposition 6, that was an attempt to get California to ban LGB teachers from openly, being out in the school district. And that's actually where we see, kind of gay rights pioneers like Harvey Milk really come into the picture, fighting back on these really insidious local rulings. But we also see this kind of cult of celebrity around people like Anita Bryant that are taking these campaigns and taking them to the national level. Cut forward to 2010, we're talking about Maggie Gallagher, the National Organization for Marriage. Maggie, a very interesting person who herself has been divorced and has in the minds of like the Greater Than campaign, a less than optimal family for raising children in. We're seeing these people reiterating these same ideas of needing to have this official sanctity, quote, sanctity of marriage in order to produce the next generation in the way that they see fit.
It also, I mean, the Moms for Liberty, they're also about the kids, they're always screaming about the kids, and yet they have pedophiles that they're having to constantly be kicking out of their organization, or just outright criminals who are stealing things. Can you break down this argument? I don't even know how much time I want to give to the argument, but this idea that, and they're just resurrecting it again, this idea that queer people are dangerous for kids.
It's an age-old argument, right? And we know it is just so false. If there's one thing that is kind of a universally beloved trope, it's this idea that, kids are our future and we'll do anything we can to protect this childhood innocence, right? And that's an idea that like everybody can get behind. And so if you frame a group that you hate or a group that you want to take rights away from as attacking this sacred, this sacred object, this idea of childhood innocence, then you can do virtually anything to that group. And so we've seen that same trope being repeated throughout, the scapegoating of all different communities that aren't just the LGBTQ community. The idea that, these like racist tropes about Black men, taking the innocence of white women when they engage in like interracial relationships. We see this in like talking about recruitment and quote radicalization into queer theory online, these crazy ideas that we can somehow turn kids, LGBTQ, rather than just simply accepting their authentic identities and embracing who they are, and that somehow evil or insidious.
We are talking with Sarah Moore, Anti-LGBTQ plus extremism analyst for GLAAD, a nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ advocacy and cultural change. I have to fit in a very quick break. We're going to have more with Sarah and continue to unpack this Greater Than campaign and where it's fitting in within the larger constellation of anti-LGBTQ extremism happening in the U.S. right now. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820 Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We're coming up on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly episode we call Unpack This For Me, where we sit down with an expert guest to take a deep dive into an issue facing the LGBTQ and Allied community. We're unpacking today the just announced and so-called Greater Than campaign, which seeks to end marriage equality in the United States. My guest is Sarah Moore, who is the Anti-LGBTQ plus extremism analyst for GLAAD, focused on countering anti-LGBTQ plus extremism and hate in the United States, which I imagine that work here extends out globally as well. Sarah, you're talking about childhood innocence, and that it bugs me when I hear that, because I'm like, the first person to punch me in the face for being gay was a kid. And when I see kids using AI right now to create, sexually explicit images to bully their classmates, and this whole, when I see what kids are doing and I try to match it up to what Greater Than is, saying, I'm like, kids are getting into this. Kids are already looking into this information. Like, they know queer folks. Not talking about this actually makes it more dangerous, because you're empowering the people who want to teach their kids violence and to discriminate. You're empowering them, as opposed to giving kids what they need to be able to be fully functioning human beings on this planet. That's my take on it. But what is your reaction to this idea of, childhood innocence and how we are teaching our kids to be good humans?
Yeah. So much of the current anti-LGBTQ movement right now is being couched in this idea of, quote, parents' rights. And I always have to put quotes on this, because what they really mean by that is parents' rights for like a very select handful of people. They mean parents' rights for the moms for liberty types who want to be able to review every aspect of their kids' school curriculums. If they see any mention of LGBTQ issues, if they see anything that would portray the United States in a less than favorable light, they see anything touching on issues of racial justice or social equality, they want to be able to go in and remove that. They're either remove their child from that situation or remove that from the lesson plan altogether. And that's not parents' rights. That's a small minority of parents that are trying to take over our entire education system and damage the rights of LGBTQ parents who already, are facing discrimination on these other aspects. And it's also putting LGBTQ students and their friends and allies and loved ones at risk in the school classrooms, like you're talking about too. If we're treating being LGBTQ as a taboo subject, how are kids supposed to feel when they're trying to explore their own aspects of their identity? They're trying to learn who they are. And all they're hearing is that this is something you can't discuss. This is, something that is bad, that's wrong, that's evil. I mean, that to me is blatant discrimination. And it can only lead to situations like you're describing, where kids are being targeted for being gay or being trans in school.
Mm-hmm. I want to unpack this because it's remarkably successful, but I feel like we're maybe turning a corner on the Moms for Liberty stranglehold on school boards, because we're starting to see, especially last year, I track school board elections, which is super nerdy, but this main site of power for affecting LGBTQ kids right now, and we're seeing them lose on school board elections, at least in 2025. Hopefully this continues to be a trend. But can you unpack for us further this idea of parents' rights not being for all parents? Because the parents who want to have LGBTQ curriculum in there, who want to have gay straight alliances in their schools, they're being sidelined and they're not being given these rights. And there are certain courts, Supreme Court, who seem to be A-okay with this argument of, well, parents' rights, but only for some.
Exactly. I mean, the whole parents' rights concept is a Trojan horse for equality positions writ large. It's a term that a certain group of parents are using, and to be clear, some of them aren't even parents, but it's a term that they're using because it hides their true intentions. Nobody is going to go out and vote for a candidate that's running on an anti-LGBTQ campaign broadly, but they are certainly going to support somebody who claims to be a champion of the parents. Again, this is striking that kind of very basic chord of hitting on these ideas of protecting the children, these ideas of parents as like the bedrock of society. Besides the fact that they are most definitely not including all parents in this parents' rights argument. They're not including the parents of LGBTQ kids. They're not including parents who themselves are LGBTQ. They're not including the vast majority of people who support, for example, marriage equality in these discussions, which, the vast majority of Americans do believe in. And so it's really just a Trojan horse to push these kind of policies into the school boards and to really change how our next generation of Americans are going to be growing up.
And for folks who are just tuning in, we are talking with Sarah Moore, who is the Anti-LGBTQ Extremism Analyst for GLAAD, which is a nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ advocacy and cultural change. And the reason why we're getting into the parents' rights and children argument of this right now, this topic, is that this is what is underpinning the Greater Than campaign, which is a coalition led by a small group of people and giving the impression that it's a large coalition of 47 organizations that are trying to undo marriage equality here in the United States. This is the question, and I'm sure this is going to be a commiseration question here, which is what I get from a lot of folks, and I'm sure you get this as well, is why are they so obsessed with us? Like, why can't they just go and live their lives?
There's going to be so many answers to that question, right? So yes, it's a commiseration question, and then it's like, why are they so obsessed with us? I think that there is something so fundamental to queerness and to the ways in which we express ourselves and the ways in which we accept so many different kinds of family structures, of life paths, of like simply having relationships with the people around us, that it really threatens their fundamental worldview. And because we are such a beautiful, vibrant, diverse community that expresses ourselves so loudly and freely, it also provides them with this kind of shield for all of these other more nefarious actions that they want to get into. One of the things that we track at GLAAD is the Trump Accountability Project. And we released some new studies showing that Trump has, for example, said this insane phrase, transgender for everybody, I think over 45 times in speeches over the last year. One, what does that even mean? Right? Like, what does it mean, transgender for everybody? But he's just saying these topics because he knows that it evokes an emotional response in his audience and that it distracts from his other plans, whether, that be Iran, immigration, these other very unpopular strategies too.
I want to get into that. I have to fit in a break here, but there is something that I've been a pet theory of mine, which is like they can be totally disparate, like fighting each other on the right side of the aisle, from the center right folks all the way out to the neo-Nazis. But the minute you say let's hate the gays, suddenly they're just all on board with that. And I'm going to ask you about that when we come back. You are listening to The Gaily Show on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820 Chicago's Progressive Talk. More with Sarah Moore after this break. From the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gaily Show. I'm John Parker. It is 33 minutes after the hour. This is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode, where we bring in an expert guest to unpack a particular issue facing the LGBTQ and Allied community. Today, our guest is helping unpack the just announced and so-called Greater Than campaign to end marriage equality in the United States. My guest is Sarah M. Moore. She is the Anti-LGBTQ Extremism Analyst for GLAAD, which is focused on countering anti-LGBTQ extremism and hate. Previously, she worked as a general associate at the University of Maryland's START Global Terrorism Database. START is an acronym. I don't mean like start global terrorism. And then she's also worked with Bellingcat's Global Authentication Project and the Prosecution Project. Sarah, before the break, you were mentioning the Trump Accountability Project and how Trump is going around talking about transgender for all. And we saw last year Virginia gubernatorial candidate Winsome Earl-Sears talking about like 57%, according to MS Now, of her advertising was about trans people. Like, this seems to be a unifying issue for them when they want to bring them all together. This is my pet theory. When they want to bring each other all together, they just have to be like, look, there's a gay over there. And suddenly they're just all on board with that. That is my pet theory. You actually study anti-LGBTQ extremism. Does that hold water?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, this is scapegoating 101. When you want to bring people together, you find a group to hate. And unfortunately, right now, it's easiest to hate groups that we don't understand. And the transgender community is so widely misunderstood in this country that they think that this is their winning ticket. And we've seen that exemplified by the millions of dollars being poured into presidential campaigns, gubernatorial campaigns, state Senate races, like all of these different political campaigns are trying to run on these issues because they think that they're winning issues. But exactly like you're saying, when we're looking at, for example, former Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl-Sears, she's not in the Virginia governor's mansion right now. It's Abigail Spanberger, who won on a policy not of disavowing trans children, but on speaking to the actual issues that voters want to hear about. They want to hear about accountability. They want to hear about affordability. They want to know that they can pay rent and that they can get groceries for their kids. And those were the issues that, she was able to win on.
I'm not remembering the number right now. Aaron in the Morning, amazing news outlet, had this number. I think the majority, I'll say the majority, we'll have to fact check me on the actual number of candidates last year that were running in the major races. Like they were all, all in on anti-trans advertising and policies. They all lost. Aaron in the morning tracking that last year. And so I hope that means we are turning the corner, but they are not turning the corner. Clearly now announcing this greater than campaign to overdo marriage equality. Where do we go from here, Sarah? Like, how are we countering this right now? Because the thing that worries me most about the greater than campaign is that we have an issue that broadly popular, like 3/4 of Democrats, 3/4 of independents, about 65% of Republicans, trending a little bit down. And the reason why it's trending down is because they have this amazing ability to pump out propaganda, lies, disinformation, attacks, because they have this amazing media apparatus. You work for an organization that studies media and also awards media, right, as well, and tracks queer people in the media. Like, this is what scares me the most, is that, okay, maybe the Supreme Court is saying, no, we're not going to take it up, but we're about to go into now a period where they are just going to be trashing us even more on an entirely new flank here. How do we begin to deal with this? Like, what are things that you think that we can do that'll be effective in countering this campaign of hate that's just going to amp up here over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, right? And to your point, we have seen how embedded media and media advocacy campaigns are in pushing these far-right ideas. I mean, even just looking at the Greater Than campaign, for example, one of the notable organizations that is, for some reason, not one of the top, listed as one of their leaders, but is definitely a big backer of this, is the Heritage Foundation. And that was exemplified by the fact that the Greater Than campaign got an exclusive in the Daily Signal, which is the Heritage Foundation's far-right media arm, right? So we see that, like, these research groups, these legal groups, these media groups, they're all tied in to the same people. They're all reading from the same playbook. And they're trying to make it seem like this is a grassroots movement, but in reality, it's being pushed by a couple of very powerful people with a lot of hate in their hearts. For me, I think when we're looking at this, the best thing that we can do is focus on, how do we find commonality and pushing back on this. In the Greater Than campaign, one of the things that's so insidious to me is that the fact that, it's not just LGBTQ people that they're targeting in this. If their central argument is that, marriage is equivalent to family structure, and that if you don't have a married mom and dad, that is not a real family, and that your kids are going to be at a disadvantage, that your kids are going to be somehow harmed by not having that. And so that not only targets LGBTQ parents, but it also goes after single parents. It goes after households where they have legal guardianship over their kids. They're being raised by grandparents or other family members. It goes after people who are divorced and remarried. They're saying that stepmothers and stepfathers, because they don't have a biological connection to these kids, are somehow incapable of also parenting them or loving them or giving them a good outcome in life. There's so many different iterations of a family, and only a handful of this is talking about LGBTQ issues. And so I think if we really showcase how this affects not just our community, but the vast majority of people in the U.S. who have experienced these non-traditional family structures, then I think that we can really raise awareness of how insidious and evil this kind of campaign is, and why the freedom to marry is such an essential right to all Americans.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's some Democratic think tanks, a certain West Coast governor, that have taken the bait. I'm not going to name names. We talk about them enough on this show, so what I'm talking about. But what I'm trying to figure out is they think that these Democratic think tanks and these pollsters, this governor, thinks that they are doing this, having this good faith conversation, but they've taken the bait. And it's just so clear, like, the only people you're just antagonizing queer voters right now. You're not actually making any inroads. But why do you think, or do you have a theory on why there are these folks on the left that are sort of trying to say, yeah, let's go in on this. Like, yeah, let's talk about and, you know, have some compromises on LGBTQ rights.
You know, this is not a new phenomenon.
Mhm.
You could look at something like, for example, women's suffrage. We saw that there was a broad coalition of women who pushed for the right of women to vote, women of color alongside white women, even though, you know, white women were the primary basis of this movement. And the second white women were able to have the right to vote, what did they do but turn on the women of color who helped in this movement and say that we should not, you know, enfranchise people of color and that they should have lesser than rights. I think, unfortunately, we're seeing a very similar parallel happening right now within the LGBTQ movement, where there's a small but very vocal minority of folks who have these, quote, established rights. And I say established because we're literally talking about a campaign that would undermine these rights, who are saying, we're good, we're equal, we're fine, we don't need to do anything else here. And, you know, these crazy trans people are, you know, pushing for, quote, equality, and they don't see it as an issue. They don't see it as something that affects them. And I think we're seeing that play out in, like you're talking about, a couple of Democratic governors or congressmen who see this as an issue that they can flip on without alienating their base, without understanding, you know, first of all, the LGBTQ movement was built on trans rights. It was built by trans pioneers. Look at Sylvia Rivera, look at Marsha P. Johnson, you know, and we cannot at this moment turn our back on these folks, not only because it's wrong on a moral level, but also because our rights are not safe either. And we have to work together in coalition to push back on these encroachments into our rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we, so a lot of the things that you're talking about here, like, we're based in Minneapolis, and I am used to my government lying to me, right? Like, I am just used to that at this point. Like, just junk science. I'm used to the Supreme Court taking junk science and being like, we live in an alternate reality, and now everybody has to live on this. But then we see the Trump administration telling you, do not believe your eyes when you're looking at all of these videos of Alex Preddy, a VA nurse, being killed. And in my head, I'm thinking about, and I cannot believe I'm blanking on his name right now, a nurse who was killed outside the Black Cat in the 1960s. And very similar situation where they said he was resisting arrest and they had to, you know, kill him. And he was handcuffed right at the time. And here you see the same thing with Alex Preddy. Can we talk about the fact that they try things out on us, and if it works, they take it out to the rest of the population? Like, I feel like a lot of the stuff they're doing right now with ICE and how they're operating and the lies and the violence, I'm like, yeah, y'all have been doing that to us for a very long time and mainly getting away with it. So are you able to sort of speak to that, of they try things out on us and then it doesn't stop with us, it goes out to the rest of the country?
Yeah, you know, when I was doing research on this topic for our call today, you know, one of the things I was looking into is the Heritage Foundation, again, one of the backers of the Greater Than campaign, and this idea of radical incrementalism, this idea that we're going to start with small steps, small, quote, small changes, small harms that will lead up to this very big radical cultural shift. I mean, we already saw this in the Dobbs decision that took away the right for women to access abortion care throughout the U.S. We are seeing this now in the vast number of SCOTUS cases that are touching on LGBTQ issues. You know, just now, for example, we're waiting on a decision from SCOTUS on a potential on looking at bans on conversion therapy and whether or not those bans are going to be upheld. And that decision literally could come out at any moment today or in the coming weeks. And we're seeing this again in these challenges to Obergefell. And in the words of the Heritage Foundation as well, they don't want to stop at Obergefell. They want to come after our so many different rights. They want to come after voting rights. They want to come after our access to birth control and other reproductive care. They are now coming after these different marriage policies that impact, again, not just LGBTQ folks, but folks in a broad variety of different marriage situations and different family situations.
Thomas
And so,
wants to take out Bowers v. Hardwick.
yep,
Which
exactly.
is the ability for us to just have sex without the cops barging into our rooms.
Exactly. And like you're saying, this is not a new phenomenon. Like we know that the LGBTQ movement started with the police raids of LGBTQ bars and nightclubs, especially at Stonewall. We just recently saw a police raid of Penn Station in New York that was targeting gay men and that were engaging in, different activities in Penn Station. And so again, these tactics are recycled. There is a playbook for these certain things. And when they don't have another scapegoat, another person to blame, they just pull out that old playbook and see, okay, what worked before and what can we use again here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very, very well put. And for folks who are, listening right now and not part of the community, and you're like, well, it's sad what's happening in the queer community. We need to work for queer rights. If you don't think this is coming towards you, like how ICE is operating is how they've been treating queer folks for 100 years. And frankly, how ICE is acting is also how the slave patrols worked, before Civil War. So there's a lot of things they've been trying out on marginalized communities here for a very long time. And we're seeing it play out with how ICE is working. And I'm very obsessed with ICE right now because we're based in Minneapolis, and that's dealing with that still. But I have another break to fit into. We're going to have more with Sarah Moore, who is the Anti-LGBTQ plus Extremism Analyst for GLAAD, which is a nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ advocacy and cultural change. So more with Sarah when we come back. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk where facts matter. Stay tuned. Quick break. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We are coming up on the top of the hour. We're unpacking, not just breaking down, the so-called Greater Than campaign, which is trying to end marriage equality in the United States. Just announced coalition of organizations earlier this year. My guest today is Sarah Moore, who is the Anti-LGBTQ plus Extremism Analyst for GLAAD. Sarah, there's a lot of science, putting that in big quotation marks right now, being used by the campaign. Can you unpack that for us, this so-called science that they're using to justify their argument?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the easiest way to say this is that there is no science. There is absolutely no evidence. One of the things that was so crazy to me in researching this group is that, they are claiming, there's a quote here. I'm loath to quote these folks, but I do think it's really interesting. They claim that every credible study of family structure proves that a biological connection advantages children, and that this so-called parental loss will diminish child outcomes. And they claim that every study that's showing that same-sex headed households have equal outcomes with opposite sex households are suffering from poor methodology. So they just dismiss an entire body of literature saying it's poor methodology without citing any of their own research. I was trying my best to find what studies they could possibly be citing here to see how valid these are. They don't give any examples. It is crazy to be saying that this is a scientific fact and have absolutely no citations. That's just basic data. I, on the other hand, took a look at what the actual science is saying. There's a 2015 Cornell study that does a literature review, which is essentially you take all the studies that have already existed on this topic and you see what they say. 75 out of 79 of these peer-reviewed studies showed that there was absolutely no difference in well-being or childhood outcome between kids of LGBTQ parents and kids of non-LGBTQ parents. The couple of studies that show something slightly different are focusing on kids where one of their parents came out later in life and it caused a separation within the family or a divorce. We know that divorce and family disruption does lead to negative outcomes for kids. That's a universal fact. That's not true just for the LGBTQ community. Mm-hmm. And so what these studies are saying is that LGBTQ households are no different than non-LGBTQ households, especially when it comes to raising kids. And I just think that that's a really important point to hone in on, because they're claiming that this is scientifically backed. There's absolutely no science here.
The thing that gets me about this, and we see it with marriage, with parenting, with healthcare, specifically trans health, is that there are actual scientists who say, okay, if we're going to treat this as a legitimate question, let's formulate it into something that we can actually research. We'll come up with a hypothesis. We'll come up with what's the evidence that we would actually need to see to prove the hypothesis, and then let's see what happens here, right? So there are actual scientists who are doing the real science and finding out things like you just said, where actually, statistically speaking, there is no difference between same gender households, same gender headed households, and mixed gender headed households, and yet people don't want to listen to the science, and they would rather listen to people who are using this language of like, oh well, scientific studies say. What are the scientific studies? Oh well, wait, no, let's not talk about that right now. Just believe us when we say that. It's so maddening to me that people will be like, oh, well, yeah, the healthcare stuff, science. Okay, show me your science. Oh, well, blah, 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 blah.
It's so crazy. I mean, that is always their point. They believe in science until the science says something that they don't like. And then it's, well, how could I possibly trust that? I have to question, the donors behind this. I have to question their, the ways that they're portraying this. It's so crazy, and it's such an anti-science platform as a whole, when all of the literature is pointing towards the fact that LGBTQ parents are just as capable of raising happy, loving, successful families as anybody else in this country.
Yeah, and I mean it is literally the definition of bias. It is literally the definition of bias when there is literally zero evidence that could be provided to you, dear listener or viewer, that would change your mind. Like if you don't have in your head, like, okay, yeah, I would need to look at this study, and if this study showed this, then yes, I would change my mind about that. Like then you're being biased, and frankly, you're being bigoted. I know they don't like being called bigots, but that's literally what they are being. Editorial opinion here on the Gayle Show. I did want to briefly talk about, I saw as we're wrapping up here, I got about a couple of minutes left, but there is a Eradicate Hate Global Summit happening in September.
Yes, there is.
Are you organizing that? Or I see you're on a panel, or I mean, on a panel, but I think you're helping lead this, yes?
No, so that's actually, it's through Dow Jones. They put on a big panel every year in September. It is in Pittsburgh in honor of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting that happened in, I believe, 2018. And it is a convening of extremism experts who, as well as victims, people impacted by extremism and hate, who get together and work on very practical solutions for addressing all manner of hate and extremism.
Great. I was doing some research and I found that, and I thought I would mention that. And then obviously, how do folks connect with you and the work that you do with GLAAD? Because you have lots of amazing articles that you are writing, and obviously there's an amazing bunch of publications that GLAAD is putting out every year. How do folks connect with you through GLAAD?
Yeah, so you can take a look at our work at GLAAD's Alert Desk, ALERT. It's our Anti-LGBTQ Extremism Reporting Tracker, and it's the project that I help run that puts together all different kinds of data points on anti-LGBTQ incidents, so things like hate crimes, hate speech, harassment, all of these different aspects, puts it on a big map, makes it public. People can see what's going on. They know what's happening in their local communities, and they also know how they can stop it. If you have experienced or witnessed an incident that you think would be part of this tracking effort, you can report this at our incident reporting form at the Alert Desk landing page. You can check out GLAAD.org for all of our other resources on a whole bunch of different topics pertaining to LGBTQ folks.
We will put links to those in the show notes and on our website. Thank you, Sarah Moore, for joining us here on The Gayle Show.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
I definitely want to have you back, because I'm sure that this is just the beginning of the conversation. But folks, thank you for listening and or watching today. In Chicago on WCPT 820, it is now time for Democracy Now! In Minneapolis on AM 950 radio, it is the Matt McNeil Show up next. Stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio. And then at 10 p.m. Central, step into the unknown with Greg Bakken on Ghost Box Radio. And until this time tomorrow, keep it queer, America.